thanks to Photo Wings, we're able to make these 7 Insider sessions completely free to audience, which is absolutely amazing, obviously. And we have an incredibly rich set of talks, discussions underway and coming in the future, as well as an incredible archive. So please do go back into the archive. There's some wonderful material already there, all on the 7 Insider site, which we'll be sharing the links to during the session. So, Ivor, you're no stranger to this part of the world. You've been working in the Middle East and this area for quite a long time. What drew you there in the first place? What's captivated your heart, your soul, your imagination, perhaps, for such a long time with this part of the world? Even you're living in you've lived in the region indeed for many years now. What is it about this story that's really made you stick with it?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on today, and for everyone who's tuned in to listen. So yeah, I mean, I first started working and actually moved to the region in 2009, which was obviously just before a big turning point in the region, just before the Arab Spring started in 2011. And I think it was that has kept me here and forged a lot of my work, or how I've come to understand the region and stayed here for so long, because that was such an important period in the region, and it was purely by chance that I ended up here before that happened. And none of us could have predicted what was going to happen in those years in between 2011 and 2013, really, when the Syrian civil war started as well. And the way I see it is we're still seeing the after effects of that period now. The war in Syria is still going on. What we're going to be talking about today, the book that I made called End of the Caliphate, which charts the kind of key parts of the battle to defeat ISIS in places like Mosul and Raqqa, you could argue are a kind of byproduct of all of that. So that's why I'm still here, and why it's taken up such a big part of my life, and I think it has for a lot of people of my generation, working and living in the region over the last 10 years.
So, at what point, so this particular chapter, the end of the Caliphate part of the story, when over what period did you work on that? When did you start it? And I know these things are very fluid and flexible, but from what period does the book cover?
Yeah, so the book is quite finite in a way. It starts, the earliest pictures are from the kind of end of 2016, when the operation to recapture Mosul from the Islamic State, from ISIS, started in October 2016, and goes on until the summer of 2018, basically, when life had started to come back to places like Mosul and Raqqa. And I followed it all the way through. I followed the entirety of the fight for Mosul. If anything, that makes up the biggest part of the book, because that was, in a way, the key city. It was a key city for the Islamic State and for their control of the region, and it was also a key battle in their in bringing them down. So it went on for 9 months in the end, which much longer than people anticipated. And that was the concept in the end of the book, to keep it quite specific, even though I have, like I said, 10 years worth of work in the region that you could almost all tie together. But when I came to thinking about doing a book, this felt like a more more understandable, more finite idea for people to digest. So it really is just about those 3 years of a period where.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? At what point do you decide that you've got material that will make a book, and also what do you leave out? And I think it's a really interesting idea that you just talked about there, that you decided to focus on one quite specific chronology, as it were, that had I suppose maybe not quite a beginning, a middle, and end, because I think you're still working on it, but at least had a tangible, coherent sense, rather than a sort of overview of an entire decade of work, which might allow you to put in a wider range of pictures and perhaps include images that you're well known for. But the danger there is it ends up, particularly with material like this, you're going to be very careful of the sort of greatest hits compilation, you know, it's not about that, it's about the story. And I think it's a great decision of yours to do that. Do you want to take us sort of into the book then, and perhaps begin to talk through the chronology? I mean, that was one of my first questions. Is the book presented in a sort of linear sequence, or is it one that's more eclectic and flowing?
It's pretty chronological, but not entirely. You know, obviously, when it comes down to editing, that's when, you know, you really start to think about those things and realize, that it doesn't always work, especially when it comes to a book. The design aspect of a book, it doesn't necessarily work to have everything chronological.
Absolutely, yeah.
It largely is. There's a few kind of points where I jump around a bit, but it largely is. This is the map that is at the start of the book, which was beautifully designed, created by the artist Molly Crabapple, who I have admired for a long time, who does beautiful work, illustrative work, and knows the region really well. And I commissioned her with through Steidl to create
Wonderful.
this.
Yeah, it's a great map. And I think maps are really interesting things in their own right, you know, and I often think of photography as a kind of map or mapping process. And so being able to commission an artist bespoke piece of artwork is fantastic. And it's a great way to take us on that journey very, very quickly across the whole region and connect up some. I think that's one of the problems, isn't it? Very often, you know, we hear of these places and we don't necessarily connect up the geography and the interactions between them, and you know, the fact that they are all bordered, you know, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and so on. You know, they're all so close to each other, and I think it's very often people forget. You know, when we look at those straight lines, you know, written across the sand by some British governor in the 20th century to create these states. So I think it's a great way to kind of get across a huge amount of information, both geographical but also emotional in a way, in a very small space. And what about the text? It's interesting that, you know, obviously Anthony Lloyd, I'm sure many people know him really well. He's an incredible reporter with huge experience of not just this region but of conflicts in general. Is Anthony somebody you've worked with a lot, and how did you decide to work with him to produce the text, and what was your brief for him?
Yeah, no, it's funny actually. I met him while we were both in Iraq covering Mosul, and I'd been a big admirer of his for years, and we'd never really crossed paths before, and we joke about it now, but he actually but we bumped into each other at the bar at a hotel where we all stayed.
As you do, yeah.
Yeah, and he came up to me and he was like, you know, Tom, is that you? And I was like, no, sorry. And I knew who he was, and he thought I was some like security guy or military contractor. And then we got to chatting after that, and I told him who I was, and that's what we started to kind of know each other. And so when it came to putting the book together, I just knew instantly that I wanted him to write an introductory essay, because he'd been covered all the way through, knows the region, you know, he knows conflict, and he knows photography as well, because he started as a photographer. And I just thought no better person to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a really great choice. You know, I mean, I think it's one thing you need to think about very carefully with books is the text. And, you know, I think I haven't read it all. Forgive me, because I haven't actually had a physical copy of the book. And I believe you had to borrow a copy of the book to show us today. Do you want to just quickly give us a look at the book? Unfortunately, I haven't seen it because I wasn't able to get a copy in Sarajevo. But I think it's great. Or I from what I can see, he's written his own text, which is about, you know, his experience rather than, you know, isn't Ivor's work wonderful kind of thing. And I think that's really, really good to see that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Contextualizing which works in parallel with your pictures. Great.
Couldn't have been happier with it, and I really didn't give him much of a brief at all. I just said, please, just.
Wonderful, yeah. Well, he's a tremendous writer, so I guess it's great to do that. Yeah. Do you want to move us forward a little bit and take us on the beginning of the journey?
That's the opener. Yeah, and so this is where the chronological aspect comes in. This is not from the start of my coverage, from more, you know, kind of halfway through almost. But you know, as with the cover as well, like this picture it just made sense to be the first picture, because it really set the tone for the book, which is, although it's about war, although it's about a very kind of brutal war, the essence of the work and the essence of that story for me was the people who were caught up in it, because that was the crazy thing about places like Mosul in particular, and Raqqa as well, but all of the areas that ISIS had under their control, was that there were hundreds of thousands of people caught in those areas. In between. So that's why this is the first picture. This is from like Western Mosul in early 2017, in March 2017. So a bit further down the line, and when they'd already taken the eastern half of Mosul, which was ostensibly less populated and a slightly easier operation than Western Mosul, which is where ISIS really had their seat of power and where there were more people packed into this very condensed area of the city, very built up area of the city. And it's also interesting to point out that this period, this assignment, and that's also important to say, is I shot most of this work while on assignment for the New York Times, although I was there in the beginning on my own, essentially freelancing, filing for different people. Eventually, I got the New York Times to pick me up and did the majority of the rest of the work on assignment for them. And this period was when I first started with them, and I'll talk a bit more about the importance of that and how it changed things for me. Sorry, for some reason I can't click through with my keyboard. I'm going to do this. It's really annoying.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so this is
So talking a bit about that sequencing, did you have a sort of an approach to the editing and sequencing the book in terms of letting that narrative unfold? Obviously you made decisions there about the chronology. How did you want to kind of bring the viewer into the journey with you, as it were? I mean, obviously you've got two great kind of establishing shots really there that show these kind of quite symbolic moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to point out as well, I've cut, I'm not showing every page.
Okay, great.
Because it would take too long. It's quite big. So I'm jumping around a bit. But yeah, this is also from early on in the book. And yeah, in terms of the editing, it was a slow process in a way, because I was, like I said, I was working on this story all the way through, and even continued covering the region and the fight against ISIS even after the book was published. So the book idea itself came up while I was still on the ground and in the middle of it all. And when it came to actually putting it together, I had a very good grasp already of what pictures were key and what had been the kind of really important moments in that story. So I would say it wasn't as difficult, and this is also pretty photojournalism. It's not a high concept book. It's just
sure.
Of a slowly unfolding news story. So I did a lot of it myself initially, and then I must say I had some really integral help from Thomas Borberg from Politiken, who I'm going to shout out to, because we'd come to know each other through various events and stuff, and I told him I was working on a book, and he just offered up his help in editing. And I will say this, there are a lot of people who will offer you help to edit a book, but when it comes down to it, they're not there to be seen, because
it's a very difficult thing, isn't it? You've got to really trust somebody, really, because you're giving them a huge amount of influence on the final product, I think, and you've got to really find some, and that's a really important point. I think it's really important you do get someone to give you that outside advice or consult with them, but they've got to be in for the long haul, and they've got to be able to really be there when you need them, because there's going to be moments when you need a decision, and if they're not there to be found, it's going to be very tricky. So yeah, I think that's a really important point when you're trying to assemble that team around you of people. I guess working with Steidl, quite a lot of the design decisions you have to work with them. Did you have your own designer on this, or was it the Steidl sort of in-house team that did that? And how did that relationship work?
Yeah. So in my case, it was their own in-house designer who I worked with on the final design, and yeah, I came to them with a pretty strong idea of what I wanted or what I envisaged doing with the book, and they helped me fine tune it. But the rough, like the raw idea was there already for me. And I'm not a designer by any means, but I just had this like um, quite clear picture in my mind of how I wanted it to look. That I wanted these, these big kind of double pages, but not full double page. And then
the book's quite kind of square, isn't it? In
it's cool. Yes, it's kind of a bit like 6:7 format, let's say.
6:7-ish. Yeah.
It's not super landscape, so that's why you don't have these really long, wide double page spreads. But you have kind of 3/4 double page spread, and it's cool. So what we decided in the end when we came to laying out was that some didn't work to the right, and so we pushed them to the left depending on where the kind of focus was
and things. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I like the balance of the page, or the way that the caption is in that bottom left-hand corner with a fair bit of space. I think it allows it to allows the picture to breathe on one side, and then you've got the caption when you want to look at it, and it's not kind of butting up against it as you often find in a lot of books. I like that gap between the caption and the image. It allows you to really contemplate the picture on its own and then go to the caption for that further information. So I think that works. And the same here with that bit of space underneath. I think that works very, very well. Just before we move on, just to go back to that picture, what were your decisions behind making this one the cover? I know a lot of the time cover pictures can be really tough choices because you're trying to balance so many different elements. You're trying to get across a sense of what the book's all about, but equally you don't want a picture. You want a picture that's representative of the whole book and not that's just one great photograph but really doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the content. So how did you decide that this was going to be the cover image?
Yeah, we went through a lot of different
I can imagine. That's why I'm asking.
It was really hard, and to be honest, like I was at a loss in the end. I couldn't decide myself, and I kind of took myself out of the equation a bit. And to be honest, it was Gerhard Steidl himself who really went for this, and
you can't argue with that.
And when he said it, and when he kind of like we had it in amongst a bunch of other options, and he was like, this is the cover, because it's very ambiguous. It could be the beginning and it could be the end, and I really like that, and I wouldn't have thought of it that way myself, but as soon as he said it, I was like, no, that's exactly it. You don't quite know what's going on.
And this one face of the young boy turning away, so everybody else is looking up, and then this one face really pulls you in, doesn't it? It really captures you.
Yeah, and
that's great.
It just ended up working really well with the format of the
Absolutely. Nice comment here from Lena Geshwi. I hope you're pronouncing it, saying it looks like Maslow's hierarchy pyramid, his hierarchy of needs. It's a great comment.
Thank you.
So so we can move on to that next spread if you want.
Yeah, just to say, and
in the back,
there was going to be a back image as well, so it was always like about kind of pairing those together. And this one
this worked very well.
Worked really well with it on the back.
But one question: Did you consider making it bilingual? By the way, because that's always something I'm interested in. With books that are about other parts of the world. Was that something you thought about?
Yeah, it was something we thought about, but ultimately, because it's largely a photo book, decided that it wasn't really worth the extra effort to go to doing everything else. I know you would have done it in Arabic, if anything.
Obviously,
what money is like when it comes to photo books, and you're paying what you're paying for is the quality of
we'll perhaps come on to the financial side of it or the production side of it in a moment.
So yeah, so there's four different page layouts throughout the book. Pretty straightforward. You've got the double pages like that, and they're either on the right or the left. Then you have some single pages with a blank page beside it for breathing space. You have these like diptychs, two single page images. And it was just all about what worked, double page, what needed to be big, what worked well together.
Of course,
Give something breathing space, take a break, because it's very intense, and very people orientated, so I started going back through my work and looking for these quieter pictures that perhaps didn't make it onto the pages of the New York Times and weren't particularly dramatic in any way, but like suddenly work for the book. And I think these are a good example.
I think that's a really good point about books as well. It does give you that breathing space, doesn't it? And I think it's same with some of the ones I've worked on. The images that end up in the book are often ones that weren't even edited at the time of shooting them, especially when you're on assignment. Actually, that's a question we had from Marianne in the audience, was just what were the steps what were your first steps? Did you work with agency assistant? Did you work with a fixer? How did you kind of work in the field, and how did you get into this in the first place?
You mean like when I was first starting out, or on this story?
Well, I guess on this particular story, is that, or had you already had that kind of infrastructure in place by the time you got to do this?
No, like I said, so in the beginning, when I was first in Iraq to cover Mosul, I was freelancing, but I was actually largely working for and filing for the UN. I've done a lot of work with UNHCR over the years because of my work covering humanitarian issues to do with conflict, and they were actually taking a lot of my stuff from the beginning, and I was really covering the humanitarian aspect at the beginning, and these pictures were from that period actually. So I was not so much on the front lines at that point, but rather on the outskirts, but in the camps, and covering the civilian aspect, but not on the front line. And that was, I've done a lot of work with them, and it's really been helpful to me continuing my work, and also they do important work, but and it's not to rubbish that, it taught me so much. But in this case, because it was an unfolding conflict, and the critical for forces, the most kind of critical moment for them was when they were trying to flee the fighting itself in the city. And I was just getting to it like too far down the line, I felt. And it's not about like wanting to be in the middle of everything and therefore get more dramatic pictures, but I just felt like if I wanted to cover the humanitarian aspect, then really where I needed to be and what was most important was to be at that point where they were, where they were fleeing, where they were being liberated.
That proximity, yeah.
And that entailed then doing military embeds, because there was no way to get inside the city itself unless you were on some sort of embed. And so that's when I started to move away from doing the kind of humanitarian stuff in the camps and working through UNHCR, and was initially going myself and going with friends on these embeds into Mosul. And it was kind of after a bit of that the New York Times picked up my work and published my first story with them, which was a combination of stuff I'd done before and stuff that I shot for them on assignment. And then, like I said, after that, they continued to send me back on assignment. And from that point on, I was really exclusively doing military embeds with the support of the New York Times, but still focusing on civilians, if that makes sense. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How I started out and how I ended up working with a huge organization like the New York Times. I had my own car, I had my own fixer, I had,
right, yeah. You have all that logistical support that a major publication gives you. Yeah, absolutely.
which is the only way you really should or could do this kind of work. You know, it's important to.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of my friends did it in different ways as well, but it makes it so much safer and easier if you're on something. You know, if you're on an embed like this, for example, this is a good, good picture to talk about that. You're in the middle of a war zone on on the ground with troops who are fighting a very vicious war. To have that logistical backup and support is huge. It's so important.
Absolutely. Actually, there's a good question a question from Santiago posed exactly about this. What makes you actually want to photograph such risky situations as this? To actually go into you said you were working a lot with the civilian population, but what drove you to want to go on an embed in such a obviously difficult, potentially very dangerous situation?
Yeah, well, like I said in the previous answer, it really all stemmed from this desire to be in the on the front line in these areas where I felt it was like most critical and most dangerous for civilians. And these pictures of the war itself, of the soldiers, were just a byproduct of me being there in trying to see what was going on with civilians. And I will say, as much as I was there with the soldiers and on embeds with them, I was also keenly aware and kept reminding myself that I was there to be critical of them as well. I wasn't there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's something that's often missed, isn't it, with the embed? All this sort of critical literature around how dreadful embeds are misses the point that a lot of the photographers who are on the embed don't. It's not like you give up your critical distance and just go along and with whatever the propaganda of that unit is. And I think you can still make subtle and important pictures even if somebody else is telling you where to go, kind of thing. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. I think it's getting harder and harder to access war as a journalist and to not end up being used as a journalist in a conflict situation, because propaganda is half of war these days.
Absolutely, yeah, if not more, yeah. I love the small details in some of these pictures, like in the one before, the guy with his monster caffeinated drink, baseball cap, and the step ladder. For some reason, I find the step ladder in the corner of this room here really fascinating. So I think you've got a great eye for scale, obviously, but also for these little small Barthian punctums, perhaps, in the images that really draw our attention. So enjoying these layouts.
Yeah, the picture on the left of the soldier is a really good example of something that didn't really make it in during the news cycle because it was too quiet, too obscure maybe, but when it came to editing the book was perfect for giving a bit more breathing space, giving a bit more texture to the edit. And I love this. I always like this picture. This is one of the rooms. This is where we were sleeping the night before with the unit who we were embedded with. You can see all their gear thrown around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in this very domestic environment. Yeah, all these these little military signifiers appearing in it. Yeah.
About 20 of us crammed into that room.
So there's a question from Santiago Leon, and hello Santiago, great to have you here with us. Saying, did you work with a local fix? And you kind of talked about this, but I think maybe that then follows on to a question again by Lena, which is a tough one. I think we've really got to think about is, how do you think about your status as an outsider and the relative privilege that you have of being able to go in and go out? And, how does that make you feel do you have a burden of what she calls accurate representation, which I think is an interesting concept? And were there any locals or Iraqis or Syrians, for that matter, involved in the project in any way? Did you perhaps work with anybody else on editing, for example, anything like that?
Well, in terms of working with fixers and translators, yes, of course. On every story I'm working on in the region, I depend heavily on fixers, not just translators, but people who know the story more intimately than I do, because it's their own, it's their own country. So, I mean, very often we're working with local journalists who are also doubling up as fixers and are guiding you on the ground. A lot of this military stuff is a bit different, because it's a lot more clear cut, a lot more straightforward, and also, you've got a duty of care to people who you're bringing into that environment. So I was often at pains not to bring too many people with me, because then you've got big questions around what risk you're putting other people at. So usually it was just me and one of our security guys, local security guys, Iraqi security guys, who would go on the actual embeds. Then when stuff was quieter, I was always working with translators and fixers, of course. And my security guy was often doubling up as my translator on the ground. I can't remember what the other parts of those questions were. Can you remind me?
I guess it's just that this question that we always have to deal with is, what right do we have to represent the lives of others to an extent? How do we justify our existence in a place like this?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I suppose the question, if I rephrase it, do you think you managed to contribute something that was, I don't say unique, but a perspective that perhaps wouldn't have been seen if you hadn't been able to do it? That's often the question I ask myself is, are you able to bring something to the story that is different?
Totally. Yeah. No, I always ask myself that. I've always asked myself that as a photographer. It's largely why I actually avoided covering news stories for a long time when I was starting out, because I was like, why would I go somewhere where there are 100 other journalists and photographers who are probably infinitely better than me and more experienced than me, to cover the same story. But at this point, you have to imagine I was a lot more experienced than when I first started out. I did feel I could bring something different and important to the table. And the further it went on, and I write about this in the essay in the back of the book, the further, the more I covered the story, and the more involved I got in covering Mosul in particular. The more I ended up being the only journalist on the ground in a lot of situations. Because
that's going to be a question. I mean, in a way, playing devil's advocate in response to that question about could a local, could it? I mean, I guess it wouldn't have been possible for somebody from the region to have done this, because you worked across a range of countries, a range of different sides, as it were. And I think it would be quite hard for somebody who was from Iraq or Syria themselves to be able to work. And I've come across that in quite a few situations like this, that very often to be able to cross front lines and to work on different sides of the story, you almost have to be from outside of that region.
That definitely helps or contributes in certain situations. But that said, I mean, a lot of my colleagues covered both, Iraq and Syria, were there, in all the same kind of periods that I was. But like I said, it's hard to explain, but like I ended up negotiating and finding a very unique amount of access in Mosul in particular that no one else really had. And
do you want to take us into Mosul, by the way, because we've been, we're in Mosul now, are we, from this picture?
Yeah, this is all pretty much in Mosul. And yeah, this is a good example. This is in the midst of the fight for Western Mosul in March 2017. And this particular morning, I remember it was really heavy fighting going on at that time in this very residential neighborhood where, I'm not sure if you remember, but there was this huge tragedy where an airstrike was carried out by the US on a building that they said ISIS were on the roof of or something. It ended up killing over 200 people.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
And they were like hiding in the basement. It's the same area anyway. just to kind of point out how packed it was, full of people. And we were embedded. I was embedded with a particular unit, Iraqi Special Forces, and went out with them, on this particular morning. It being a big, kind of big push in the previous days, huge fight going on. And we were in this kind of no man's land where, if you imagine to the left of this image is the front line. I'm coming from the kind of rear base where the Iraqi forces were. And this is the point where people are finally kind of free of the ISIS controlled area, have been liberated, let's say, freed by the army, and are managing to flee for the first time. But I'm in this like weird no man's land. And I remember the feeling acutely in this kind of situation. You look around, there's no one else there. It was just me and my security guy. No other journalists, no soldiers in some cases because they're further forward. And it was a huge privilege in a way to be able to work there, but a huge responsibility as well. I felt the only person around. And this is, in this day and age, I mean, I think it's always been pretty hard to end up in these situations, but in this day and age, to get that kind of access and end up in those kind of positions is really hard. And I think that's a good answer. And it's a bit of a get out from me to the question about representation and whether someone from the region could have done this story. It's not about whether someone from the region could have done this story. It's just that I ended up being the person who was there and had this.
I mean, that's a really, really valid point, isn't it? I think if we look in the history of photography, there are a lot of bodies of work that only exist in the public domain because of the sheer bloody-minded stubbornness of one individual, Vietnam Inc., and I think your book is like that too. Yes, absolutely, potentially somebody else or an Arab photographer could have done it, but in the end they didn't, and you did, and I think that's valid. That's a valid position in many ways. And one question that was interesting was censorship. You're on embeds, you're working with the military. So was there any official censorship? Then was there any self-censorship? Were there images that you yourself decided to pull out? And then also there's an interesting question from Paul Marotta, who's one of our great regular supporters, which is fantastic for these sessions, asking about when you did the book, did the New York Times have any say, or did they put any restrictions on usage of images or anything like that? Or, do you just have full copyright and full ownership of the images that you're using? So basically three versions of censorship there.
Yeah, just to finish on the point, I don't want anyone to think that there aren't lots of amazing
absolutely
and Arab photographers,
of course,
are friends of mine who were there covering this story as well and did do amazing work. So I can give you a list.
Absolutely,
I don't want anyone to think that I have some sort of ownership over this story. Anyway,
of course. No, very, very good point. Very good point. Yeah.
Censorship. No, not really. This was again one of the unique aspects and kind of levels of access that we had in Mosul, where once you had access, once you had permission to be there from whichever unit or faction of the military you were with, and usually it was down to a commander, someone who your fixer, your contacts knew, who was willing to let you go with them. Once you were in, they didn't try and control what you were doing to a large extent. Of course, there were some situations where they didn't want you to see things and to shoot things. I can talk about that. There's a picture a bit later on, but like, say when it came to later on in the conflict, and it was happening all the way through, but I only really was confronted with it in the end when things were particularly brutal in the end in the old city in Mosul, and they were really just killing everyone in this tiny area that was still controlled by ISIS. And there were a couple of situations where they caught prisoners, ISIS guys who were still alive, which was the only time I'd ever seen that. The only other, ISIS members I'd ever come across were either in jail, in prison, or they were dead. It was the only time I ever saw them alive was in that last kind of period in the old city, which was the most brutal where a lot of the killing went on. And there were a couple of occasions where I was there when this happened, and I would manage to shoot a bit before they would take the guy away, and then they would stop me at a certain point and say, okay, you can't come any, you can't follow us anymore. And I mean, I knew what was going to happen. I can say with near certainty what did happen is that they took that guy around the corner and they executed him. But was I allowed to see it? No. Did that mean then I didn't get access, or I wrote some big expose about what they were doing and therefore didn't get access? No, because everyone knew it was going on. I photographed it as much as I could, and I insinuated what happened, but I didn't see it.
Following on from that, Santiago again has a question, which feel free to talk about as much or as little as you're comfortable with, but saying that clearly a lot of us that have covered these kind of situations, it does leave its scars on us mentally. And how have you managed to process that and process events like that mentally? Have you managed to find a way to live with that in your life, or have you struggled with that? And have you sought outside? I mean, it's great. I think definitely looking for counselling can be a really important way to help with these kind of things, for example.
For sure. Yeah, I've struggled with it immensely at different points in my career. The difference was when the same thing I was talking about earlier, when it came to covering Mosul, I was 10 years into my career already, and I had probably, this was the most brutal stuff I'd ever really witnessed, and it was the most challenging, the most dangerous, but I was so much better equipped to deal with it than when I first started out. The first war I covered was Libya, which, as we know today, marks 10 years since.
Yeah, I was going to mention, absolutely.
Yeah. And that was my entry into covering conflict in any real way. And I wasn't there when that happened, but I was closely connected to people who were and affected by that. And I remember going to Tim's funeral in London, and it hit us all really hard, but particularly if you're younger and that's your introduction to covering conflict, and it very often is for everyone. That's what happens. You start getting injured and dying, and it really messed me up for a pretty long time afterwards. I took a step back. I said, I don't really want to do conflict, and I don't know if I ever really did. Like I said, I'm more interested in the civilian consequences of war itself. So I was never too gung-ho about it. But of course, when you're there in the middle of a war zone, the pull is somewhat magnetic, and you end up probing and going a little bit further. I will say, I've just learned how to cope with it a lot better. And that's through, talking to people, having good friends, having good family, having a normal life outside of this. I don't live this. Like, I have the privilege, and that's where the privilege comes in, of going and working on assignment somewhere with great support and great kind of levels of comfort compared to a lot of people. And then I come out and I live in a pretty normal place where I can switch off. And I think sadly that is key to it. If you're stuck, you've no way out, then it's going to take it. But it's still
so
dark.
Returning to that idea of photographing civilians, we have a question from Marianne Sievers about how do the people that you're photographing respond to your presence when you're in such difficult and life-threatening situations? What kind of interaction, if any, what kind of what happens in that moment, that space between you and the subject that you're photographing?
That's a good question, and people have asked me that a lot with this work, and it's a troubling one for me because I'm someone who is used to, and I learned photography, I learned documentary photography. I didn't study news photography, let's say, or photojournalism. And I came up doing very slow, long-term projects about people, and would often live with people and spend hours and days and weeks with people photographing them, and would get to know them intimately. The weird thing about covering a breaking news story like this, and particularly in a war zone, is the chance you have to connect with people is altogether different. It's so fleeting. Half the time people don't even even realize you're there because of what's going on. This picture is a good example of that. This was in the wake of an ISIS suicide car bomb that had gone off on a street in Western Mosul, and this guy, this was the son of the man whose body is in front of him, who had been killed when he was like walking up the street to go to the shop around the corner from their house, and had got caught up in this bombing. And this was the moment his son had like discovered that his dad had been killed and found his body. And I was there, you know, photographing the carnage, the scene afterwards, and just happened to be there when he came up and found his dad's smoldering body. And of course, he didn't pay any attention to me. He didn't even recognize that I was there because he was in such a state of shock. And I did not go up to him and start asking him how he was feeling or, you know, how he was. So that's an extreme version of that kind of situation. But yeah, a lot of the time, people either don't even realize that you're there, or they're really happy that you're there because there's no one else around. And you know, sometimes it's just complete consternation as to why you're there. Like, what are you doing? Why have you given up your life to come here and cover this? And so overall, I have nothing but kind of positive experiences from the people who I'm photographing. If it's ever to the contrary, I don't take pictures. I'm not someone who's going to jam a camera in someone's face while they're mourning the death of their family member. But it can be really troubling. You know, you can be left with these huge kind of questions after seeing stuff like this. But
no, of course, yeah,
justify
it is very difficult. I mean, the whole issues around consent and could you even ask for consent in a situation like this, I think is very, very difficult. You know, I think you're right though to point out there's a difference between news photography, even news photojournalism and documentary. And I think for me, the longer you're spending with the subject, the more important it is to build that consent process with them, and but also the more opportunity you have to do that. It's very difficult to do it in a news situation, I think, and not always appropriate. You know, where do you draw the line? You know, about that, because if you're not asking it in certain situations, why are you asking for it in others, and vice versa? Maybe just start to move as we start to come to a close, just sort of thinking a bit about the book and the process of getting the book done. I mean, at what point did you feel like this was a book, and how did you approach Stidle, and then what were the steps that you went through to actually get it out there, and then what's happening to it now? What's the kind of post-production process that you're involved in terms of obviously we're here today talking about it, which is a great way to promote it, but you know, just talk a little bit through that process really of how the book, what was the gestation and birth of the book, if you like.
Yeah, we've been talking quite a lot. Sorry, I didn't realize.
No, it's great. It's really interesting conversation. Don't worry, getting some good comments.
Yeah, you'll just have to go and buy the book now to actually see it.
I hope so, yeah. We sent links out to it.
So yeah, the idea of doing a book came to me probably in early 2018, the end of 2017, after I had covered Mosul. Mosul had come to an end. I'd already moved on to covering Raqqa at that point, and Raqqa had been liberated in October, November of 2017. And it was at that point that I started to realize that I had quite a large body of work, and also had this, you know, this feeling that I didn't want it to be forgotten, you know, and just fade away as the news always does. And so started playing with the idea of doing a book myself, and started playing with edits and, you know, some kind of basic design, and yeah, just put together a PDF and a blurb and started sending it out to people. And I sent it out to 4 or 5 different publishers who I thought might be interested. Got a really good response from everyone, but the majority of people said, "Oh, it's great work, it's really powerful, but we don't really publish, you know, books about war photography anymore because they don't sell. But if you have, if you have some money, if you have your own,
exactly, yeah. If you've got 15,000 euros, we'll do it. Yeah.
I mean, thank you, but like, I don't really feel like you really believe in the work. If you're only going to do it if I've got money, like that doesn't feel like much of a collaboration to me. But it's, it's not really that simple. It's a very difficult industry. I get that. But Steidl were, say, the biggest publisher I went to, and I really didn't expect to hear anything back from them. It's very unorthodox for them to do these kind of things as well.
Yeah, it's not a typical Steidl book, is it? It's usually
they've done a couple of
different. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Conflict books, but
yeah,
really not very often, and particularly not that kind of hardcore photojournalism. And lo and behold, I held out, and then they called me like a couple of months after I'd sent in the application, and I just sent in a pitch via their online submission guidelines. I didn't have any sort of special introduction or anything. And yeah, they called me up like a couple of months later. Gerhard Steidl himself called me up and just said like straight away, I want to do your book, and yeah, you should come to Germany and we'll start talking about the design. And it was like, I don't know, I didn't really believe it at first. And it happened so quickly. I was like, well, I'm still in the middle of shooting it. I don't think I'm finished yet. But the timeline worked because they were thinking of it for later the year. And in the end, it didn't end up coming out until 2019 anyway. And so that's how it started. And I went to Germany twice over the course of that year, probably 2018, 2019. First for an initial design consultation and to work on the design and the layout and everything. And then I went back, and some proofing. And then I went back early in 2019 for the printing. And it was, yeah, it was printed in the beginning of 2019, all done at their, offices in Germany. They have their own printing press. It was incredible. It was one of the most
amazing experience.
Fun experiences I've ever had as a photographer. It was a dream.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Great. Well, I mean, we've had some really great questions. If anybody wants to ask one or two last questions, please do type them in the question box. We've got one about Santiago, again from Santiago, but stretching a little bit. He's obviously very complimentary, saying that you are a fantastic, excellent photographer, but you also stand out as being very multi-talented or multi-platform. And capable of writing and shooting video as well. So how do you kind of balance or regard those different aspects of what you do? You've got three quite substantially different things there. You've got news photography coming into documentary. You've got doing a book, which has its own rhythm, its own sort of time frame, and its own kind of life. And then you've got video or moving image production. How do you rate, the different, how do you decide which one of those is right, and how much energy do you put into each of them in terms of developing your career? And in other words, how important are these different skill sets for you as a professional, and also how important do you think they are these days in the eyes of editors? With the New York Times asking you to shoot video, for example, and do packages that weren't just stills.
Yeah, I really don't do that much video, to be honest. I mean, thanks for the the compliment, but I'm not any good with video at all. If I ever do shoot video, it's just like short clips. So what they do ask us to do now is to keep a kind of vlog of what we're shooting, and then maybe if it's a particularly vivid scene, sometimes video does work better or kind of add something. I'm a pretty hardcore photographer and traditionalist in many ways, so I don't always think to shoot video, but I've got better at understanding that in some situations video works really well. But honestly, it's pretty basic stuff.
Okay.
I've written more and more over the years, and did so throughout a lot of this coverage for the New York Times, and that was new to me in the sense that it was stuff that was getting published. It wasn't just project descriptions for my own purposes or for pictures and stuff. And it was a huge learning curve, and it was really interesting. It was really eye-opening for me to kind of believe or understand that I could write, because I never really believed that I could write at that level.
Interesting.
And I think, I think if you can demonstrate all of these things, it only makes you much more employable as a journalist. Whether they want you to do that and like bring all of those elements into a story or an assignment, the fact that you can do it and prove that you can do it just, I think makes you seem like a more complete journalist and visual reporter. I think every photographer should be able to write and should be able to shoot rudimentary video. It's really important.
It's all part of the craft, isn't it? Yeah. Have you got any last pictures you want to show us before we wind up? You pretty much through just run us through the last few spreads, perhaps.
Yeah, I kind of just picked a bunch of.
I said I really like the scale of the images. I like the way that a lot of the time you're just stepping back that little bit and allowing the situation to breathe, which I think works very, very well in the book format.
Thanks. Yeah, it was my first book. It was all a learning curve.
Of course, yeah.
But I really look forward to doing another one, to be honest. I'm thinking more and more about now that I've done it. It always seems so unattainable to me, and so complicated.
Sure. But once you've got the first one done, then it becomes much easier to imagine the second, doesn't it, and the third, and whatever. Yeah.
Obviously, working with someone like Steidl makes it a whole lot easier, because you're not having to crowdfund. You're not having to raise funds yourself. They have.
Well, it's great to have that introduction to them. If you can continue with that vein, it'd be amazing. Yeah, fantastic.
I hope so.
It's a real journey, isn't it, of emotions, this story, taking us through an incredible arc of experience there, and very poignant image to finish on there, I think. So thank you very much, Ivor. That's been a fascinating hour. You've taken on a wonderful journey with you, and thank you for being so honest with us as well, with your emotions and your feelings and your insights. And we had about 70, 80 people, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for the audience. Obviously, we've got events going on continuously with Seven Insider and the book club and talks and so on. But a big round of applause, Ivor. Thank you very, very much for fascinating talk. And keep following us. And thanks very much for your time. And keep safe.
Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, and cheers, Paul. Thank you. Bye.